chapter 5 of the story. As we continue in with the story, we need to continue to keep in mind how God's upper story began in the garden. He had created this perfect environment where he could walk and talk and enjoy fellowship and relationship with the people that he had created. He had made everything creation available to them except for the fruit from the tree of knowledge. Well, we know that they chose this one thing that was forbidden, which led them and us to be banished from the garden. So God has taken another approach to continue this relationship with humans through the creation of this nation. And through this nation, he would reveal himself among them. God had preserved this young nation through a famine. And then he had rescued his people from slavery in a foreign land. Now, through his servant Moses, God was ready to lead these Israelites into another garden, the land of Canaan, which is described as flowing with milk and honey. It was the promised land where God could build this nation, out of which he would reveal his presence, his power, and his plan for all people to come back into a relationship with him. After the release from Egypt, these Israelites wandered in the wilderness as God prepared them to enter into this promised land. He wanted his people to get it right this time. He desired to come and dwell among them. God's desire for intimate relationship with us is the heartbeat of that upper story. He desperately wants to experience life with us. He tells Moses that there are three things that had to be worked out in order for God to dwell among the Israelites. The first thing was God insisted that his people live by a set of guidelines. If we look to Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 through 17, it says there, "And God spoke all of these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of their parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses my name. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to your Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving to you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. God had envisioned this community in which all people were treated with respect and dignity. But he saw how poorly we humans treated each other throughout the ages. So God developed these clearly stated rules, these 10 commandments. we have here. For the sole purpose of creating a community where everyone got along with each other and with God. But as humans, we generally don't like rules very much. Correction, we think rules are necessary for everyone else except for ourselves. Rules tend to get in the way, and we really don't like anyone forcing us to stay within the boundaries, except for the ones that we set for ourselves. We defy authority when other people tell us what to do. Now, on the other hand, we insist that rules are being enforced on someone else's behavior towards us. For example, I want the police to catch the people who are speeding past my house, but when I'm driving just slightly over the speed limit, I'm the exception. This is the Israelites' perspective in the lower story. They thought, I can do whatever I want, whenever I want. It's all those other people who need the rules. The only problem is that living by their own rules consistently got the Israelites into trouble. In God's upper story, he was telling them, I want to be with you. But first, you have to learn how to treat each other, which is why I'm giving you these rules. When everyone thinks the rules only apply to others and not themselves, then nobody follows them. Because of people's attitudes towards rules, they only see God as this distant judge who sentences lawbreakers. People envision God as hurling all these rules down at us and these regulations so eventually that he can catch them and then punish them. This distorted view is far from the truth. These commandments are a gift from God, who knew that without guidelines to show his children how to live, they continue to make life miserable for themselves and for others, because they'd never figure out how to get along on their own. The purpose of the Ten Commandments was to be indispensable tools for improving every aspect of our lives. Now, the first 4 commandments, they apply to our vertical relationship with God. All of them ask us to treat God with ultimate respect. We are to worship only him. We are not to create any idols. We're not to misuse his name. And we're to honor him by observing a day of rest. In these first 4 rules of life, God invites us to be all in. He wants our hearts, he wants our minds, he wants our bodies to be focused on our relationship with him. The rest of those commandments are guides in our horizontal relationship with each other. After being told to honor our parents, God prohibits murder, adultery, stealing, lying, and coveting what doesn't belong to us. It comes down to God telling us, don't do anything that would hurt or harm anyone. Later on in the story, we find Jesus summarizing these 10 guidelines by saying, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Pretty simple, right? Love God, love each other, don't hurt anyone, don't take advantage of anyone. Obey these commands, and we'll all get along. These commands, they set the boundaries for the kind of community that God desires for his special nation. The second thing that needed to be done was a place for the presence of God to dwell in needed to be constructed. He instructs the Israelites to make this sanctuary for him, and he would then dwell with them. They were to make this tabernacle and all the furnishings exactly as they were described. This word tabernacle means a tent or a place of dwelling. And this was the place that God would meet his people. From our lower story perspective, the Israelites might have thought such an elaborate blueprint was a bit excessive. This tabernacle represented much more than just a fancy place to worship. Through its construction, God wasn't just building a sanctuary, he was building up a nation. He needed to know that the Israelites would obey him completely. In the early period of their wanderings, the Israelites' dedication to God seemed just a little shaky. When Moses went up onto the mountain to receive the commandments and he was gone for a long time, they felt abandoned. So they decided that they needed something a little more concrete in which to place their trust. So they demanded that Aaron, who was the brother and helper of Moses, to build them this golden calf, a visible God that they could worship. After all that God had done for them, this is how they responded. Moses pleads with God to not destroy the Israelites then and there. Like a loving father, God kept his commitment. With the tabernacle built, he would dwell among the Israelites, and they would know his presence with them. The third thing that God required was a way to restore fellowship between a holy God and a sinful people. This gap between his perfect holiness and their flawed selfishness had to be overcome. God desperately wanted to reconnect with us humans, but sin stood in the way. Now, if we take a look at the book of Leviticus, God lays out a way for his people to atone for their sins. Now, I have to admit that reading the Leviticus is not exactly a page-turner, but is one of the most important books because it lays out what has to happen before sinful mankind can be reconciled to God. Like the instructions for the tabernacle, all these elaborate instructions on sacrificing animals without blemish so that the blood can atone for the Israelites' sins have a deeper significance. God is essentially telling his children, the one thing separating us is your sin. I want to do life with you, but the only thing that will cover your sins is the purest and most valuable blood. Now, in our current Western culture, this idea of animal sacrifices may seem primitive and cruel, but for the Israelites, is the only way that was there to bridge that gap between themselves and God. The symbolism that surrounded these sacrifices is humbling and meaningful when you look at it. A pure, innocent lamb of great value took the place of their punishment. What began back in that garden, God's vision for a perfect community with his creation, now finds itself played out in a wilderness with this nation that wanted a relationship with God but didn't know how to go about being a community. From our lower story perspective, it seems ritualistic with all these commandments, the tabernacle and the animal sacrifices. But in God's upper story, we get a glimpse of what is to come and his vision for this perfect community where he can finally be with his children. Because sin had permanently infected the people, God made a way to reconcile us. No matter how hard we try to be good, we can never be good enough on our own. So God provided the blood of a perfect lamb, innocent of any wrongdoing. These sacrifices for the Israelites were temporary until another lamb with a capital L was sacrificed. One who would actually defeat sin and death and prepare a final community where God's grand vision for his people would be fully realized. We find that in Jesus Christ. With a set of guidelines to help them become a nation that God had promised to Abraham and a way to atone for their sins, all the Israelites had to do was to follow God, who was dwelling among them during the day as a cloud and by night as a blazing fire. What could be any easier than that? This nation was supposed to be different so that the entire world would know and come and worship the one true God, who is the source of life and of hope. But the people complained, and they were forced to wander in the wilderness, as we will hear next week. Amen. Please